There was a practice many years ago that most people aren't aware of, one that preyed on the most vulnerable. It's a practice that is so disturbing that it almost seems impossible to even think about, and yet it still occurred up until the beginning of the 20th century. This was a practice known as baby farming. Without getting into too many details just yet, it is exactly as horrific as it sounds, and it attracted some of the worst people to ever walk the earth. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The warm October sun did little to soften the chill that ran down James Mahoney's spine as his shovel struck something unexpected. He had been working alongside Frank Cooney, a fellow worker, in the backyard of 25 Buren Street in a suburb of Sydney, Australia. They were digging a trench to connect a service pipe to the main sewer, and it was backbreaking work and the men were drenched, but the moment Mahoney's shovel lifted a clump of dirt and revealed what lay beneath, the work stopped. At first, Mahoney thought it was a bundle of rags, like maybe some discarded trash from the previous tenants. But as he bent down, he saw something else. It was flesh. He then took a closer look and realized it was the small, decomposing remains of an infant buried just 6 inches below the surface. The men then immediately went silent and exchanged uneasy glances before hurriedly reburying the tiny body. It was just too much to process in the moment. Maybe, just maybe, it had been some sort of accident, some sort of tragedy that no one spoke of. The next morning, they returned, hoping that in the light of day, the previous afternoon's horror would seem less real. But instead, the nightmare only advanced. As they dug further, just 30 yards from the first site, they uncovered a second body, this time of a female infant. Unlike the first discovery, there was no mistaking what they had found. Someone had buried these two here deliberately. The Newtown police arrived shortly after, and Senior Constable James Joyce stood in the yard surveying the horrific scene. The bodies would end up being determined to be badly decomposed, and the forensic examiner estimated that the female infant had been buried for 6 weeks and the male for more like 3 months. The tenants currently living at the house had only moved in 3 weeks prior, meaning someone else had buried the infants before then. Suspicion then turned to the previous occupants. John and Sarah Makin were by all appearances an ordinary couple struggling to make ends meet in late 19th century Australia. They had been raised in a world where hardship was the norm and survival often depended on cunning, resourcefulness, or sheer endurance. John was born in 1845 in Dapto, New South Wales, and was the fourth of 11 children in a family that struggled immensely. Sarah was born the same year in Sydney and was the daughter of a former convict turned miller and endured her own share of instability. Her first marriage ended in divorce, which was quite a rarity in that era, but she found security in 1871 when she married John, at least sort of. He was at that point a brewery delivery man with a steady, even if unimpressive income. Together, they would go on to have a large family, bringing at least 10 children into the world, 5 sons and 5 daughters, although they could barely afford to care for them. For much of the 1880s, John took on work wherever he could find it, but never held onto a job for too long. He drove carts, hauled goods, and made deliveries, but his reputation for laziness followed him. In 1881, he was convicted of theft and spent 3 months in prison. Then in 1885, he was employed as a greengrocer's delivery driver, and a year later his horse-drawn carriage struck a 4-year-old on Elizabeth Street. This left the boy with a severe concussion and in critical condition. Interestingly, John rarely seemed troubled by the consequences of his actions or his declining financial prospects. His final known job was as a driver for a business owner, but he only lasted 6 weeks before abruptly quitting. And this was just as well because those who knew him said he never seemed to have much heart in his work. And so, by 1892, while living on Levy Street in Chippendale, he stopped working altogether, apparently spending his days sitting in front of the house while his wife and daughters managed the family's affairs. Despite this apparent lack of ambition, though, John was always eager to boast his supposed wealth. He told neighbors he was receiving £1 a week from a property he had inherited from his mother after her death in 1890, but whatever money he might have had, it was never enough. The Makin household remained miserably poor, forced to move frequently, and never settling in one place for long. It was during this time of financial hardship that John and Sarah found a new source of income. By the late 19th century, something known as baby farming had become a disturbing thing in Sydney. Advertisements in newspapers hinted at the idea, promising adoptions with no questions asked. And desperate mothers, often unwed and burdened by the heavy stigma, sought out women willing to take their infants in exchange for a fee. Disturbingly, for anywhere from between £3 and £5, a woman could rid herself of the shame of an unwanted pregnancy, trusting that her child would be raised in a safe and loving home. But for many of these infants, the promised future never came. Sydney, like much of the Western world, was grappling with the silent epidemic of syphilis. The disease was rampant, affecting rich and poor alike, but it carried an especially cruel fate for newborns. Many were born with the infection, and these infants were considered sickly and unwanted and were often given away for mere pennies, with their fates all but sealed the moment they left their mother's arms. For baby farmers like John and Sarah, these children were nothing more than a means to an end. The fewer resources spent on the care, the greater the profit. And while some baby farmers did attempt to provide for the children entrusted to them, the survival rates were dismal anyway. Malnutrition, disease, and neglect claimed the lives of many, and when a baby died in a farmer's care, there was little incentive to report it. Some were buried in shallow, unmarked graves, others were simply abandoned, because apparently there was no legal oversight and no institution tracking where these infants went, and no one truly looking out for them. For John and Sarah, baby farming was an opportunity. Sarah was a midwife by trade and was well positioned to offer the reassurance these women needed, while John played the role of the stable, trustworthy provider. They promised women that the children would be cared for, loved, and raised as their own, but in reality, the babies they collected seemed to just disappear. Whether through neglect, starvation, or something even more sinister, they didn't survive long under the care of the Makins. The couple apparently moved often, discarding their tiny victims before slipping away to another rented home, where they would start the cycle all over again. By October of 1892, when the first bodies were discovered, the Makin family had once again relocated, this time to 6 Wells Street in Redfern. It was part of how they operated, moving frequently enough to never arouse suspicion. And for years, the Makins operated in the shadows of this brutal trade. Women, desperate and afraid, placed their trust in Sarah's soft words and John's empty assurances. Like, for example, when 19-year-old Agnes Ward placed an advertisement in the Evening News in April of 1892 looking for a kind lady to adopt her baby boy, John and Sarah answered the call. They then met with Agnes at the home of a midwife where she gave birth to her son Charles just 2 months earlier. And John, ever the practiced liar, told her they had recently lost their own child, little Johnny, and that this boy could take his place. They would then promise to care for him as one of their own and give him a life she couldn't. The price of this supposed salvation was just £5. The Makins also told Agnes that they lived on Kettle Street in Redfern, but that they would be moving to a farm soon. She unfortunately believed them as she handed over her son and watched Sarah bundle him up and carry him away, and she also believed them when John promised to send their new address so she could visit. But as you might have guessed, she never saw her son again. Months later, the body marked with a C was found buried at 109 George Street in Redfern and was identified as that of Charles Ward. And unfortunately as well, Agnes was not the only mother to fall for the couple. In May of 1892, Claire Risby put a similar advertisement offering a premium of £5 for the adoption of her infant daughter. A response then came quickly, signed under the name McLaughlin, with an invitation to visit a house on East Street in Redfern. On May 16th, Clara, accompanied by her stepsister, took the child to meet the couple. Sarah greeted them warmly, assuring Claire that she would raise the little girl as her own. John apparently claimed that they had inherited money and that they were planning to open a poultry farm in Rockdale. He even promised to stay in touch and provide updates on the child's well-being. But 2 days later, Claire visited to see her baby, only to be told that Sarah was out with the child. Then when Claire returned once again, the house was empty. Amber Murray's story was unfortunately no different. In June of 1892, the 18-year-old mother of a newborn named Horace placed an advertisement looking for a motherly person to adopt him. The Makins again responded, this time signing their letter under the name E. Hill. John and Sarah then met with Amber, inspecting the baby, and told her that he was exactly what they were looking for. They said they could give him a home filled with love and a proper upbringing. She then handed over £3 along with the paperwork for the adoption and left her son in their care. But a day or two later, the Makins disappeared again, resurfacing at their next home in McDonaldtown. 4 months and possibly even years, no one suspected anything nefarious. No one noticed the quiet disappearances or the unmarked graves left behind when the Makins moved from house to house. To the outside world, they were simply a struggling couple doing what they could to get by. But in reality, every new home they settled became another graveyard. The authorities had no reason to investigate either, not yet anyway. This would only finally begin to change on that unremarkable October afternoon when Mahoney and Frank began digging in the backyard of the home on Buren Street. And even after those first two, no one really knew the scale of what they had uncovered. In fact, even when another body was found a few days later on Zamia Street in Redfern, police had little reason to suspect a serial offender was at work. It was only when Joyce, the senior constable, began searching the backyard of 6 Wells Street, the home where the Makins had most recently lived, that the first real sign of something dark emerged. He noticed recently disturbed earth, but when he dug into it, it was empty, as if someone had been there before him. With this discovery, police began to suspect that the body found on Zamia Street had not been buried there originally. Instead, police believed someone had recently dug out the body and relocated it, possibly to avoid suspicion, and that meant that the person responsible was still out there. As this was being pieced together as well, the first 2 bodies discovered by the workers were examined and determined to be a male child between 5 and 8 months old at the time of death, and the other was a female infant. And although their identities were still unknown, one thing was certain: they'd been buried in the yard while John and Sarah were still living in the house. The case was by then entirely in the hands of the city coroner, who convened a jury in late October of 1892. Witnesses were then called, including the workmen who found the bodies, the doctors who performed the autopsies, and even the neighbors who had lived beside the Makins. When John and Sarah took the stand, they were calm and prepared. Sarah claimed that after moving into the McDonald town home in late June, she had taken in just one child, a female infant about 2 weeks old, to wet nurse for a payment of 10 shillings a week. She also insisted that the mother had taken the child back, saying she was moving to Melbourne. John apparently nodded along, backing every word. In his closing statements, the coroner addressed the jury, making it clear that while they could not determine how the babies had died, their secret bearers alone were suspicious. But within minutes, the jury returned with an open verdict, meaning that there was not enough evidence to determine guilt. John and Sarah, it seems, evaded justice for the moment, but this was only while police began digging deeper into their past. Joyce then led the effort, combing through every residence the Makins had occupied over the past several years. On November 2nd, 1892, police returned to 25 Buren Street, the home where the first bodies had been discovered. They then dug some more, and the results were shocking. 5 more infants were found buried in the backyard, and with that, there was no longer any question that this had been happening for years. As you might imagine, the people of Sydney were horrified as the full scale of the crimes began to emerge. The newspapers seized on the story, and in the streets there was a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Who were these people who had masqueraded as caretakers only to discard the lives entrusted to them? And while it seems there was some vague awareness of baby farmers before, it had never been on this scale or with such cold calculation. And so, the following day, on November 3rd, John and Sarah were arrested separately. Their oldest daughters, Blanche and Florence, were also detained for questioning, and under pressure, Blanche admitted that her parents had coached her to lie at the inquest, instructing her to deny that there had been multiple infants in their care. As the weeks passed afterward, the investigation expanded beyond Buren Street. Police dug through yards in Botany, East Street, Kettle Street, and St. Peter's, all former Makin residences. And with each excavation, another horrifying truth was unearthed. By only November 12th, authorities had discovered a total of 15 bodies scattered across various homes where the Makins had once lived. And although the sheer number of bodies and decomposition made individual identification nearly impossible, one case stood out: the murder of Horace Murray. His mother had handed him over in good faith, believing he would be raised in a loving home. Instead, his remains were among those recovered, but they were sufficiently identifiable for authorities to have a case they could finally prosecute. On November 28th, John and Sarah were formally charged with his murder. So what had started as a chance discovery by 2 laborers had now become one of the most notorious crimes in Australian history. By the time John and Sarah stood trial in March of 1893, their names had become infamous throughout Australia. The sheer scale of their alleged crimes had shocked the public, and newspapers painted them as cold-blooded criminals who profited from desperation. Yet simultaneously, despite the overwhelming horror surrounding the case, the trial itself would hinge on whether the prosecution could actually prove murder. Since Horace's mother Amber had personally handed him over to the Makins in exchange for payment, and his body had been found buried in one of their former residences, prosecutors believed this was the strongest case against them. Proving the actual cause of death, however, remained a challenge. Many of the remains were too decomposed to determine how the infants had died, and without clear evidence of violence, the defense argued that the children could have died of natural causes. In fact, this was an argument that had been used successfully by baby farmers in the past to escape conviction. The trial began on March 6th, and John and Sarah sat together, but their demeanors could not have been more different. John apparently sat with his arms crossed, cold and unbothered, with his face unreadable. Sarah, however, kept her face buried in her handkerchief. It's not clear if this was a deliberate performance to get sympathy or realization of the magnitude of the charges, or even a genuine show of guilt. But whatever the case, as expected, their lawyer argued that no doctor had been able to prove that Horace or any of the others had been murdered. The prosecution, however, was relentless. They called Amber to the stand, and she gave damning testimony, recounting how she had entrusted her child to the Makins, believing they would care for him. When shown clothing found in the body marked with the letter D, she recognized them instantly. These were the same garments her son had been wearing the day she handed him over. And in turn, this was the most concrete link between the Makins and a specific victim, making it clear that Horace had died in their care. A key witness for the prosecution would also end up being Constable Joyce, who had led the investigations. During testimony, he described finding bloodstains on the clothing of the deceased, particularly beneath their armpits. Based on this, it was his belief that the Makins had used an instrument like a needle or a hat pin long enough to reach the heart. The location of the stains meant that it was also a method that left no visible injuries on the body and ensured a quick, silent end. And although this theory was impossible to confirm, the jury listened in stunned silence as Joyce painted a picture of cold, calculated decisions. With every subsequent witness, the prosecution chipped away at the story, showing that their pattern of deception spanned years, multiple houses, and countless victims. And although the evidence was entirely circumstantial, there was simply too much of it to ignore. By the end of the trial's third day, the prosecution rested its case and the defense declined to present any witnesses, and John and Sarah did not take the stand. Instead, once again, their lawyer attempted to cast doubt on the evidence, arguing that there was no proof that any of the deaths had been deliberate and that the jury was being asked to convict based on emotion rather than facts. On the evening of March 8th, the jury retired to deliberate, and at 10 o'clock the following morning, they returned with a guilty verdict. Both John and Sarah were convicted of the murder of Horace, but in a surprising twist, the jury added a strong recommendation of mercy in Sarah's case, maybe influenced by her tearful, fragile appearance throughout the trial. John and Sarah then sat silently as the judge prepared to deliver their sentence. The judge then wasted no time in condemning their crimes. He described how they had preyed on the desperate mothers, taking their money under false pretenses while sealing the fate of those they promised to care for. He reminded the court of how callously they had buried them, essentially tossing them away. He also acknowledged that while the exact method of murder could not be determined, the sheer number of bodies spoke volumes. Then, at last, he passed judgment. John and Sarah were both sentenced to capital punishment. Following that, though, per the jury's recommendation, he promised to forward a petition of clemency on Sarah's behalf. The moment these words left his lips, Sarah apparently collapsed in hysterics, wailing repeatedly, quote, "Oh my babies." For many people there to witness, this was a hollow, disturbing display. She had buried victims in shallow graves without remorse, but now she portrayed herself as the victim. John, by contrast, again remained eerily composed. Following this first trial, their lawyer immediately filed an appeal with the Supreme Court, arguing that the trial judge had improperly admitted evidence. He claimed the prosecution had wrongfully introduced testimony about other bodies found in various homes, and argued that this evidence had unfairly prejudiced the jury against his clients. On March 23rd, the Supreme Court convened to hear the appeal, and the judges took a week to deliberate, finally delivering their ruling on March 30th. They would rule that the appeal was dismissed in full, stating that while the defense had valid concerns, the sheer weight of the circumstantial evidence against the Makins made their guilt undeniable. So with no hope left in the state, the Makins turned to the highest court in the British Empire, the Privy Council in London. For the case to reach that court, however, the New South Wales government had to first grant permission for the appeal. While this request was being considered, the Executive Council actually commuted Sarah's sentence to life imprisonment. This decision was likely influenced by the jury's recommendation for mercy, as well as the public sentiment that while she was guilty, she had acted under John's control. Meanwhile, at the same time, John's punishment was put on hold for 3 months while officials waited for the Privy Council's decision. But on July 21st, the appeal was dismissed once again and the conviction was upheld. John would make one final desperate attempt to save himself. He wrote directly to the Premier of New South Wales, arguing that the evidence against him was weak. He begged for his sentence to be reduced to life imprisonment, hoping for the same clemency that had been granted to his wife. The government, however, refused once again, and on August 11th, the Executive Council made its final ruling. John's punishment would proceed as planned. Just after 9 a.m. on August 15th, John stepped onto the gallows flanked by guards. His face was impassive and his posture was rigid as always. Unlike his wife, John had maintained an air of detached defiance, and even then, in the final moments of his life, he showed no fear or remorse. Few were permitted to witness it, and by all accounts, John met his fate with the same cold indifference that had defined him throughout the trial. Then came the moment, the trapdoor fell open, and that was the end. He had spent his final days largely alone, although his family visited him one last time, and he left behind 2 written statements. In one, he continued to deny his guilt, claiming that he had been wrongly convicted. The second was addressed to his children, written in affectionate, almost fatherly terms. This was a final contradiction from a man who had shown no affection to the infants under his care. But while his life had ended, Sarah's story was far from over. She had escaped capital punishment, but would face the slow, drawn-out punishment of life behind bars. Inside prison, Sarah was treated with the same contempt as any cold-blooded offender. Prison records describe a quiet, unassuming inmate who kept to herself but carried an air of resentment. Over time, she was assigned work within the prison, and by 1898, she had become a hospital attendant. Despite her relative compliance, though, her health began to deteriorate during her incarceration. She suffered from intestinal hemorrhages, a condition that worsened over the years, leaving her increasingly weak. In 1907, her daughters began petitioning for her early release, citing her declining health, but the request was denied and Sarah remained behind bars. Then when a new government took power, Sarah's daughters tried again. In 1911, they renewed their plea, asking that Sarah could spend her last days with her family. Sarah was then quietly and anonymously discharged into the care of her daughter Florence on April 29, 1911. As the years passed, her health continued to decline, and on September 13, 1918, Sarah died at the age of 72, with the official cause of death listed as senile decay and heart failure. Although she had lived for 25 years after her husband's death, Sarah never truly escaped the shadow of her crimes. To the world, she was no grieving mother or victim of circumstance. She was Mother Makin, the woman who had helped bear the innocent one shallow grave at a time. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.